Okay, as we begin our next module, we're going to be discussing something called economic growth. And this is kind of an interesting concept that's a little bit different than everything else that we've been doing so far in this course. So the first thing we should do is define what actually is economic growth. Well, a basic definition is very simple. It's an increase in the quantity of goods and services produced from each unit of labor or workers are more productive. Maybe that doesn't seem so simple. Actually, I think it'll be very simple once we take a look at it. But let's read it again. An increase in the quantity of goods and services produced from each unit of labor, or workers are more productive. So what it's really saying is that essentially for some reason, we're getting more goods and services out of the same number of workers. Now, or in this case, we might reduce it down to just looking at one worker. And for that one worker, for some reason, that one worker can produce more than they used to be able to produce. One of the things that I want to make sure is clear at the beginning of this lesson is that this concept often gets confused with the idea of economic expansion. And that's really what we've been doing up to this point. We've been trying to, for example, if we were in a recession, to expand the economy. What we're going to be looking at is something a little bit different in this unit. And here's an illustration of what I mean. Here's what economic expansion is. If I was to go to the gym and do light weightlifting to maintain my current level of strength, if I went a couple times a week and just did some light weights with maybe a lot of repetitions just to make my strength stay exactly as it is and maintain what I've got, to make sure that the body I have now is working as well as it can. That's economic expansion. So think of it this way. When I'm at full employment, my muscles are working the way they should be. When I'm in a recession, I maybe haven't exercised in a while and my muscles they're not working the way they really should be. But at some point, I might decide rather than just doing a lot of light exercise to maintain my level of fitness, I might decide that I want to grow my body. Economic growth, the best illustration I can give you, would be bodybuilding. Something that's going to increase the size of your muscles and their capacity. Actually going to make it possible for them to be even bigger and stronger than they once were. There's a couple of different ways that we can illustrate the concept of economic growth. We're going to start with one right now, and I think it's the easiest to help us understand the difference between economic expansion and economic growth. And it's called the PPF. And you might remember the PPF from earlier this year. At the very beginning of the course, we learned about it. It's called the Production Possibilities Frontier. And the reason we used it back then was to illustrate the idea of opportunity cost and using our resources well. You might remember that point A, for example, in this example, is sitting on the PPF. And what that meant was that in this example, if we produced 2,000 tractors, then we could produce 700 cars while using all of our resources as best as we could. It wouldn't be possible to produce more cars than 700 if we produce 2,000 tractors. And if we produce less, then we wouldn't be using our resources well. So for example, here's point B. At point B, we're not using our resources as well as we could. We should be closer to that blue line. Now, from a macro point of view, think of it this way. Think of point A as being at full employment, meaning we are using all of our resources as best as we possibly can. If we're at point B, we are essentially in a recession, meaning that there are lots of resources we're not using that we should be using. Now, we also learned earlier this year that a point like, for example, point C is currently not possible for us to reach. This is where the idea of economic growth comes in. If my only goal was to get out of the recession, then I would simply want to get the economy to move from point B to point A. And that's what we've been doing all year long. We've been getting the economy to work better using fiscal policy, using monetary policy. That's been our goal. And that's, again, 95% of what policymakers do. But we also want to keep an eye on the idea of economic growth. We want to someday be able to reach point C. Or if you'll recall from a PPF, what do we want to actually do? We want to actually push our PPF outward. We want to push it to the right. If we do that, if we create economic growth, if we make our economy's muscles bigger, then it's possible we could actually eventually reach point C. So again, to use my illustration, moving from point A to point B, if I get to point B, it's probably just because I haven't been using the muscles I already have, and I need to tone them up a little bit to get me back to point A. But point C would be if I really hit the gym and started using big heavy weights and wanted to build my muscle. Or from the point of view of macro policy, again, point B is a recession, point A is full employment. Getting to point C and pushing the PPF to the right, that's economic growth. Now, why do we care about economic growth? Why do we want to focus on that as well as focusing on fixing our economy, right? Isn't our whole goal just to get back to full employment? Well, it normally would be, but think of this example. Who might this person be? A person that has no access to television, has no air conditioning, has limited access to good medical care, has no access to the internet or email, and cannot make phone calls. Who might that person be? Well, in 2014, we would think of that person as probably being someone who's fairly poor, maybe lives in an undeveloped country, or maybe has very, very limited income. That's probably true in 2014. However, who would that person be in 1880? In fact, it could easily have been the richest person in the world. No matter how much money you had in 1880, you couldn't have any of those things. So here's why I point this out. If the only thing we focused on was what life was fixing the economy, getting us out of recessions, then we would always be trying to get us back to the same place we were. We would try to get it so that in 1880 everyone maybe had a horse, or maybe that every person could go to a coal mine and work, or that the richest people in the world could have an extra set of, I don't know, dishes or more helpers around their house. But that's not always our goal. That's an important short-term goal. But looking long-term, we also want to say that, you know what? We want to make it possible for people to do things that no one, in fact, can do right now. So things like the invention of television and air conditioning and the quality of medical care. All of those things are things that only have happened since economic growth. A good economy in 1880 still wouldn't have included television. We needed economic growth to get us to the point where we could do that. And that's why economic growth is important. How does economic growth occur? This is really the important part of our lesson here in understanding why does this happen. Okay, remember, what's the goal have to be? To get economic growth, we need workers to be more productive. In other words, the same worker can produce more than they used to. All right, well, there's a lot of ways that can happen. The first one, improvement in technology. If technology is improved, workers can do more with the same things. Think of the example of somebody who perhaps produces a loaf of bread. If you were kneading every loaf of bread by hand, you probably wouldn't be able to produce too many loaves of bread. But if you were given a machine that kneads the bread for you and could do, say, 10 loaves at once, then you could produce an awful lot more bread and still be the same worker. So worker productivity, one way to improve that, and therefore one way to improve growth, is to improve technology. A second thing is increasing natural resources. If I'm a baker and I'm standing around because I simply don't have any more flour to produce bread, then I can't produce bread. So maybe I only have enough flour to produce one loaf of bread. No matter how long I stand there, no matter how much technology you give me, if I don't have any more flour, I can't produce more bread. So more natural resources, better natural resources, can often be a way that we improve economic growth. An increase in investment in capital stock. Now that's a fancy word we need to take a look at for a minute. Increasing investment in capital stock. Well, what do we mean by that? Okay, well, there's two kinds of capital. Now, we've used the word capital so far this year. You might remember that at the very beginning, we learned that capital is one of our main resources. Capital, specifically physical capital, is let's start. Capital in general is anything that makes producing other goods easier. And we break capital into two categories in this unit. The first is called physical capital, equipment and structures used to produce other goods. So, heavy equipment, bulldozers, perhaps computers. All of these things are things that are used to make the production of other goods easier. And you can actually put your hands on them. They're actual physical structures or equipment. The other kind of capital, which we often don't think about but is equally as important, and by the way, I'm sorry, these are some examples: bulldozers, machines, factories of physical capital. The other kind that's equally important is human capital. And human capital is the knowledge and skills gained by workers. Again, I go back to my bread maker. A bread maker that has very little experience is probably going to take quite a long time to mix and knead one loaf of bread. But over time, the bread maker learns more skills. Maybe another bread maker teaches him how to do it better. Maybe his experience shows him some tricks that will speed up the process. That is really an important thing. In fact, it's so important we give it a name called human capital. And what is included in human capital? Things like education, experience, and training. And I often say to my students, one way to think about capital is something that you don't really want for the thing itself, but for what it can help you produce. People generally don't get educations just for the sake of an education. They get an education because of what it can do to help them improve. We don't usually buy a bulldozer just for a bulldozer. We buy the bulldozer because it helps us produce something else. We don't like to push around dirt just for the sake of pushing around dirt. We do it because it helps us produce something else. Capital is the key thing that allows economic growth to occur. If we spend more money on capital, what we are doing is we're investing in things that make it easier to produce other goods and therefore improve the productivity of workers. All right, now, because that's true, we need to spend a minute on interest rates. The first thing we should note is that there is a clear link between interest rates and economic growth. Why? And here's the big reason. Remember a minute ago we said that capital, investing in capital, is one of the most important things we can do to make economic growth occur. Well, here's the thing. If investment is the main driver of economic growth, what do we already know is true about investment? Investment is very sensitive to interest rates because investment often requires loans. Big machines, big bulldozers, college educations often require loans. They are not things we can pay for right up front. And because that's the case, it means that higher interest rates make it more expensive to borrow that money and invest in capital. It's harder to get that education. It's harder to get that heavy equipment. It's harder to make those investments in capital if we aren't spending money, and we aren't going to spend money if borrowing that money becomes much more expensive. And the key thing there is interest rates. So what's the sum of this slide? Higher interest rates negatively impact economic growth. The higher interest rates are, the more difficult it is for economic growth to occur. And in many ways, that's the question that's going to be asked very often on the AP exam. They're going to want to see that you can tie together the change in interest rates and the change in economic growth. So the question we have to ask then is, what events change interest rates? And really what that means is that any of these events that increase interest rates hurt our ability to have economic growth. And we know them. What are some of the things that affect interest rates? Well, one big one that's often referenced on the AP exam, are debts and deficits. When the government runs a debt or a deficit, remember what happens is we have less savings. And so the supply of loanable funds increases and interest rates increase. But because that's true, that makes it harder for us to invest in capital. Decrease in savings. If people save less money, interest rates rise, it's harder to invest in capital. Here's another one. Increased borrowing for things other than capital. Remember that borrowing money or increasing the demand for loanable funds also raises interest rates. Now, there are three kinds of investment you might remember. There's investment in housing, there's investment in inventory, and there's borrowing for things that aren't even considered investment. Credit cards are a good example of borrowing, and we very rarely buy investment things with credit cards. We buy consumable things like food and clothes and things like that. Anytime we do that, anytime we borrow for something other than capital, we're raising interest rates. And therefore, when we go to finally buy that capital, it's more expensive. Okay, I want to spend one more minute here on the lesson explaining how we can illustrate economic growth. We've already seen one way in this lesson. We can illustrate economic growth by showing an outward movement or a rightward movement of the Phillips curve. Excuse me, not the Phillips curve, the production possibilities frontier. A second way we can illustrate economic growth is using the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. Let's start first with our long run aggregate supply curve right there in the middle of our screen. And we'll add to that our supply curve and our demand curve. And you can see right now that we're at full employment. In fact, there's Y star. So at this moment, whatever quantity of stuff we're producing, whatever our GDP is, at that point, Y1, that allows us to be at full employment. We're using our economy as best as we can. We're using our resources as best as we can. Now, if economic growth occurs, here's what's going to, and remember, what have we done all semester? We've been trying to move aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply back and forth to get us back to this point, get us back to Y1 star, to full employment. If economic growth occurs, then we have a different scenario. Economic growth occurs when our long run aggregate supply curve actually moves to the right. Now, I know that seems a little bit strange because we've talked all year long about aggregate supply being mostly constant. Well, it's not really mostly constant. It's just that we needed to think of it as constant in our earlier lessons. We were focusing just on the short run. But in the long run, if we're looking at economic growth, we can have a shift to the right of the long run aggregate supply curve. Now, notice what's happened. At this new point, we've gone from Y1, this quantity of our GDP right here, to this new quantity of our GDP, Y2. If that's true, then what it means is that we are producing more things at full employment at Y2 than we used to. We used to only need to produce Y1 to be in full employment. So in effect, because our muscles are bigger, because we've grown our economy, we actually need to produce more to say that we're using our muscles as best as we can. So one way to illustrate, or a second way to illustrate economic growth, is to shift the long run aggregate supply curve. It's also very important to note that one other thing happens when we have economic growth. All the things that we've mentioned, if you think about what causes economic growth to happen, increases in productivity, more education, more efficiency in the way we do things. If all of that is true, that may all sound familiar, because what all of that does is it also lowers our cost of production. And so one of the other things that happens when we have economic growth is not only does the long run aggregate supply curve shift to the right, but so does the short run aggregate supply curve. So economic growth essentially causes us to have more capacity to produce, and at the same moment allows aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply, to move as well, so that our new full employment means that we're producing more GDP, and better yet, we're doing it at a lower equilibrium price level. And that's a pretty good thing, and you can see why economists are very interested in economic growth. All right, let's summarize this lesson. Economic growth results in, first, the long run, Long run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right and increases full employment GDP. The short run. The short run curve shifts to the right, lowering the current price level and increasing the current GDP. Very importantly, and this is really important, shifts in aggregate demand are not economic growth. And that's something, again, that often gets confused when we're doing fiscal policy and monetary policy and we're sliding aggregate demand around all over the place. That is not economic growth. That is trying to fix an economy that's not working well, even with what it should be doing. Again, economic growth is trying to make our economy stronger in general. Okay, let's do some examples. Let's start with, if there is an increase in the quality of public education, what would happen? Well, first we would say that economic growth increases because of an increase in human capital. If our education system is better, people have more training and more ability to produce. So we have an increase in growth. And again, the explanation we might use, the phrase we'd want to use, is because we have more human capital. All right, let's try another one. A new sales tax encourages savings. Well, economic growth will increase because what happens when we have more savings? Think the loanable funds market. We end up with lower real interest rates. And that leads to an increase in investment in, keyword, capital stock. If I had to put this answer on an AP exam, I would not have gotten the answer right unless I included the word capital stock or capital at the end. Because, this is important, investment alone is not good enough. We have to conclude that the lower interest rates are causing us to spend more money on investing in capital. Just saying investment could mean investing in housing, it could mean investing in inventory, or it could mean investing in a way that economists don't really mean investing, like putting money in the stock market. None of those create economic growth. Only investment in capital creates economic growth. All right. A civil war in the Middle East decreases access to crude oil. All right, we've cut back on our natural resource access. Not surprisingly, that will cause a decrease in economic growth. Because limited natural resources limit a worker's ability to produce. Again, if a worker needs to, for example, go to work in order to produce, but he can't get there because he doesn't have enough gasoline, he can't produce. If a worker needs to use a lawnmower to cut the grass, but he doesn't have enough gasoline to operate the lawnmower, it doesn't matter how hard that worker works, he cannot produce. So in this case, decreasing access to natural resources is limiting economic growth. All right, now let's have you try one. The government runs larger and larger deficits. Stop the recording and try to figure out what exactly is going on here. Okay, the government runs larger and larger deficits. Now, if we're thinking about deficits, we should be thinking about that loanable funds market. And what do deficits do? They create higher interest rates by decreasing the supply of loanable funds. So, economic growth will decrease because the deficits will create high interest rates and decrease investment in capital stock. Okay, let's try another one. New computer technology allows the typical worker to produce more. Again, stop the recording here and give it a shot for yourself. All right, computer technology allows the typical worker to produce more. And actually, that is the definition of economic growth. In this case, economic growth will increase because workers are more productive. In this case, thanks to more technology. All right, lastly, let's try one more yourself. The government offers a tax credit for spending on research and new technology. Pause the recording here and try it for yourself. Okay, now a tax credit, remember, is sort of like a gift from the government for doing something specific. In this case, the government, for some reason, wants us to spend more on research and new technology. Well, obviously, if the government is giving us a credit or a gift for doing that, people are going to do more of that. And what do we know about research and technology? Well, research creates human capital and therefore leads to new technology. Economic growth then will increase. This is ultimately an investment in capital. And again, think about it this way: research, technology, they're both capital. They're both things that make the average worker more productive, able to do more with what they already have. Okay, that concludes our lesson on economic growth. Please return to the course homepage and try some practice problems.